Hi guys, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about one of my favourite things in all of League of Legends, which is macro, specifically the macro of smaller leagues. Today we're going to be talking about the LJL's macro and why it holds itself back with its lacking macro. And we're going to be doing that by talking about the exploration of cross-mapping, defending sieges, and their setup around neutral objectives. If anything I said just said sounded foreign to you, hopefully I will explain it succinctly when needed, but if I fail to explain anything sufficiently, feel free to ask in the comments and I will get round to addressing it at some point. So the first and most striking thing to address is cross-mapping. For those that don't know, cross-mapping is the idea of reacting to a move by your opponent on one side of the map by making your own move on another side of the map to try and negate any advantage they might get. The example that happens in most games is when one side looks to get a neutral objective and the other side looks to trade that for standing gold in towers or trade a Rift Herald for a Drake. The underlying idea when it comes to cross-mapping is that it's always a trade-off, and the greatest skill that one can develop for cross-mapping is the ability to assess the benefits of each individual action. However, the issue with cross-mapping is that you can make incorrect assessments, and that can lead to some very, very funny situations where you can end up trading for something that's completely not worth it, as seen in NA, where they used to trade Drake for Nexus.
Ooh, FBI! Wants to try
Wait, who is tipping?
What
What are they doing, by the way? Look at
What?
this.
Did you see Pearson? Oh wait, they're just they
They're
lost the
ending
game.
the game.
Wait, what? Okay, they got Cloud Soul though. They got Cloud. They got Cloud. It's fine.
And as I will on it says in that clip, at least they cut Cloud Soul. Anyway, moving on from the NA slander, cross-mapping is still something that the LJL is very much getting used to. Pretty much every neutral objective that spawns in the game results in a team fight whether it makes sense or not. In the first round of playoffs, for example, the only real example of cross-mapping that could be seen was when Hawks left Marble to farm in the bot lane to try and get him an advantage ahead of his lane opponent's soul. So as we can see here, we've got the two teams lining up to try and take a Rift Herald, and you can see that the bot lane from Fennel, if you look down at the minimap, the bot lane from Fennel has come up to try and take the fight, whilst Marble has left himself down in the bot lane to try and farm the wave and eventually try and get turret plates, whilst the rest of the team tries and delays the Rift Herald, tries to reduce the advantage you can get from Rift Herald. They even got a pick here, which is nice. They got the flash off of Soul as well. So it's a really nice individual play, at least in theory. The reason why this was so good in theory is it allowed one of their best players, on a carry champion as well, to get a significant advantage over the enemy ADC, who was an integral part of the enemy's win condition. However, when they contested the Rift Herald, the way the Hawks lineup set up in a way that made them vulnerable to be collapsed upon a lot of the time. So whilst in theory they made a really good play, it could be easily punished by better teams, but it's a good start in terms of ideas, especially within a region where there isn't a lot of cross-mapping going on a lot of the time. So one of the first ideas that I had to battle with when I came up with this video, or this video idea, was why is there not a lot of cross-mapping in Japan? And why is it so poor and relative to all of the other teams? And I think the main reason is that the top teams rarely have to do it. And when they do have to do it, a lot of the time they're playing a worse team, and that worse team tends to lose their advantage that they have that's forcing their enemies to cross-map through their own mistakes. So in most regions, unlike Japan, every team has to cross-map at some point. So why is this not the case for Japan? I sort of said it earlier, but the reason is really simple. In most regions, there's like a level to which top talent can be found among some of the bottom teams, and as a result, upsets are kind of common, or like leads for the worst team are kind of common, and so the top team has to be proactive. However, this isn't really the case in Japan. Japan almost has a tiered system for all the talent in the league, where you have DFM and normally one other team, which in Spring was Sengoku at the top. Then you have like contenders tier who can't really beat the top two teams, but are a lot better than those below, which in this moment in time is Hawks, your Fennels, your Sengoku Gaming, and technically Crest Gaming Act. And then you have like the Axie's Burning Core tier, who will always finish between 5th and 7th. This year they're going to finish 6th and 7th, and never challenge those above them. And then you have the V3 tier, where there's a lot of talent, like Washidai, HRK, Dresscode, and Heto are all pretty solid Japanese talents, but they don't always gel, and they tend to always underperform. This means that the top teams are only really challenged by teams within their own tier, so they get advantages from the start of the game against literally everyone else. These early game advantages lead to that team getting pressure all over the map and having priority in terms of making plays, as they've got more gold and their champions are more powerful early on, and they're able to dictate the way the game plays out from the start. In other regions though, when a team falls behind, they make proactive plays to try and cut into that advantage and have a high chance of making a big play to throw themselves back into the game. This is a part of the cross-mapping, as like, if let's say the team that's ahead is trying to take Drake, the team that's behind might go and trade for turret plates and get ahead in gold rather than trying to get those permanent stats directly from the Drake. However, because cross-mapping is like kind of new in this region, The bottom teams hardly ever try to cut into the advantages, especially like V3. That's where they're really so much worse than every other team. And this means that the top teams are rarely ever forced to contest with cross mapping coming against them. They rarely have to do it themselves because they're always ahead. And so this means the top teams can just get away with just dictating the way the game plays out early on, and arguably pretty much almost as soon as they load into a server. So the next big issue is how teams act in the endgame, specifically teams whose bases are currently being sieged. This is the part of the game where I think the league does the most cross-mapping, maybe not in the best way, but at least it's an idea. So if you look at the game and the state that's currently being played out, you can see that DFM is sieging CJ's base, but if I can direct your attention down to the minimap, you will see that there is a Kha'Zix trying to take a T2 top lane. Meanwhile, his team is getting absolutely destroyed and his base is being burnt alive. It's being taken really easily. This is the part of the game where I think that the LJL actually does its cross-mapping the best. This is a clip where it shows it at its worst. As the team that's behind attempts to pick up any standing gold on the map with one of their carries, whilst the rest of the team tries to hold off the siege. This isn't technically a bad idea, but you end up with lots of situations like this because a lot of the time, by the point a team tries to do it in the LJL, they've already given up like Dragon Soul, or the enemy's got a Baron buff, or they're like one item completed ahead, and this makes the defensive job of holding off the siege near impossible, and the gains from the cross-mapping become essentially zero, because the benefits from the standing gold become less valuable when your team is already losing a turret in base, losing a Nexus turret, or losing a Nexus completely. This means that in reality, all you're doing is making the game end early because you've left it too late to be proactive, and suddenly all the pressure is on 4 players, and you're suddenly taking a 5v4 way too often. This also applies to the late game flanks that every Japanese team seems to make once their base is being sieged. The teams try and leave a player in the jungle to get a flank on the enemy team so as to get a good engage in what might be a final team fight. The issue is that the enemy team doesn't really know where you are, and they don't really have to engage you because you're just one person. And if they do find you, they will just collapse, and that will be you dead, and that's now a guaranteed 5v4. Anyway, if they don't try and collapse on you, they might just deathball, or they might take 2 lanes, in which case they don't really need to focus on you, because they can focus on that 1 lane and collapse, or they can focus on 2 lanes and get a flank on your 4-man roster that's stuck in the base whilst you're trying to get a flank. This means that the team with an advantage can always collapse on the defenders, leaving the flanker isolated on an island to watch the rest of his team die. Technically, this as a solution could work if the risk of taking a 5v4 is not as appetizing, or if the risk of being flanked by a particular enemy champion is too great a risk to take. This was seen when Kinatu started picking up the Jax earlier on in the regular season this year, where he managed to stay level with his lane opponent, but Jax being a very strong champion, he was then able to get a flank which took out the enemy ADC and won his team a team fight and basically turned the game on its head. However, that was one game. It's become way too popular to try and do this as a last-ditch solution, and it results in devastating results for your team. And this links back to the cross-mapping and the fact that losing teams take too long to be proactive, which means the losing team never finds themselves in a situation where the enemy is scared of taking a 5v4 in their base, or thinks it's too much of a risk and they should hold off to try and get Drake, as you can see another game that's ended in 26 minutes. So then let's get on to setting up around neutral objectives, which is an issue that I touched on earlier, which is the way that teams try and set up. The LJL, like pretty much all leagues, suffers from the issue where teams turn up at a neutral objective and just watch their opponents take it. However, I think the league does it more than any of the major regions, and I think this is kind of inevitable given their cross-mapping is lacking relative to these regions. And the watching of your enemy taking the neutral objectives basically happens because a team doesn't know where they can get an advantage, and that they believe there is an expectation that they should at least be seen to contest the neutral objective, as neutral objectives are so important. They give stats, they give gold, they give lots of gold, they just make it harder for you to lose if you take them. This can also lead to a team getting wiped if you stand and watch, as when a team is watching, they almost always are weaker, and they feel like if they did take a team fight, they would lose it. And so if or when they get turned on by the enemy team, so the enemy team stops taking the objective and turns and takes the fight, they almost always get destroyed because they're not ready for a team fight and they're not actually strong enough to take it. Additionally, there are issues with just setting up around neutral objectives in general, which I'll touch on now. So the issue that these teams often have is that they'll set up in chokes when the other team has a Markile, or they'll do what they do in this clip eventually, where they set up too close in the river, or they set up split, and that leads to a team getting, if it's split, the team gets slowly picked off as they lose individual players, or if they're too close, then they get hit with an AoE down, something that does AoE, and they get absolutely chunked out, and they can no longer contest. This means that the one that I find most interesting though in this league is when a team is too split up, because this makes target prioritization much easier for a team, and the target prio is something that this league really struggles with. So basically, if you're splitting it up, you're making your enemy's job even easier than it needs to be. They're just going to win the fight much more easily, because target prio becomes a lot easier when there's a choice between a carry or a tank. I'm going to go for the carry because they're both next to each other, and then everyone else is miles away. Whereas if like all of you are relatively close, then they've got to choose between 2 carries who are vulnerable, or if no carries are vulnerable, they've got to just hit the front line, which makes it a lot harder to choose what you're going to hit. And it means that in this league, at any rate, like there's several targets being hit, which means you're doing less effective damage. Another issue that compounds all the previous problems is the way in which the teams approach drafts. So I know Evie's not in the league anymore, but he is a great example to try and show the issue of the one-trick like nature of this league. So a lot of the teams will always draft comfort picks. And the league has a significantly limited player pool because it's just a Japanese league, so imports are everyone but Japanese. Well, technically not, but the region loves to just pick Japanese players and then put Korean imports of them. And this means the player pool is obviously limited. And almost all the players have a very similar restricted champion pool, which reduces the number of ways in which the league can approach the meta. So most teams will only stick to the comfort picks, and whilst this has the benefit of not putting a player on a pick they're unfamiliar with, as you can see, like even things like Sion and Gwen, which Evie plays way too much, he's got only 8 games on. Even as you get down, he's got lots of, like, there's a lot of champs down here at the 2 and 1, but then you've also got Nara at 75 games. And this means that players are not as likely to pick up new champions, and this means that issues are compounded, as it's a lot harder to achieve certain things without certain picks. It's like when Kinatu picked up Jax back up, and in the split, as I mentioned earlier, and he made it a staple again in his picks. It allowed his team's flanks to be more effective and encouraged others in the league to try and copy him, which led to a view that flanking was OP as a crutch if your team was behind, as long as you had the gold on a good carry. But teams didn't understand why it was effective. The reason why it was effective is that Jax was a strong pick, and Kinatu is a good Jax player. And Jax is a pick who can tank a lot of damage and deal a lot to the enemy's backline. He could also win lane into a lot of common top lane picks in this league, allowing him to often accrue a lot of gold no matter how bad his team is doing as a whole. This meant he could always be effective when his team was behind in a game. And so, when other people tried to replicate this idea on different champions who weren't as effective when his team was behind when the team was behind, or couldn't keep as equal when their team was behind, or required their team to get ahead, or couldn't tank as much damage but had a greater output of damage, or could tank more damage but couldn't output as much damage, it meant that the team had significantly worse results, but they were looking at Kinatu, who was getting relatively consistent results on Jax, and were like, what on earth's going on? And so you can see sort of the issue that it can bring into a league. Admittedly, I'm making it sound like it was a several weeks issue. This was about a 2 weeks issue, but we still sort of see it with the fact that a lot of teams do still go for these flanks. It's just they're not going for it in the same way, and they're not as confused as they were about why it was working for Kinatu and not for them. So that's the conclusion to the video for now. If you've got any comments you'd like to add, feel free to add them. I will try and address every comment. And we'll see what happens in the future. Tomorrow, or tonight, because the game is technically at 11 PM, I will be doing my first LLA live viewing. Expect the video to come up tomorrow, though, because I don't think I won't be doing any editing before that point. Obviously, as you can sort of probably tell from this video, I do limited editing anyway, and I think the editing at like midnight, well, it wouldn't be midnight, it'd be like 3 AM, would be significantly worse. So I hope you have a good day, and I'll see you for the next one.